I'm in the K through 12 strand, so the teaching in public school strand. But I used to teach in an IEP, and I'll get more into my background a little bit into the presentation. The name of this presentation is A Process Genre Approach to Teaching Writing in IEPs. And I hope everything works here with the presentation. Okay, great. So here is a cartoon. You're probably all familiar with Calvin and Hobbes. It says, I used to hate writing assignments, but now I enjoy them. So likely students sometimes come with this idea that writing assignments are difficult, and they might have this feeling. The goal after this today, and by using this writing model that I'm going to present, the goal is for them to end up enjoying them and having a better awareness of what is involved in a writing class and a writing assignment. So we'll go with that. Okay, this is the abstract here. This presentation will cover strategies for applying the process genre model to expository genre writing courses offered to university-bound students and IEPs. The introduction of this writing model prior to university entry better prepares your students to meet the demands of the academic discourse community they plan to enter. So I have a question for you, and I'll try to involve the audience today, just so it's not me speaking the whole time. What do you know about discourse communities? What are discourse communities? You could provide an example or a definition. Anyone? What's a discourse community? We are all part of the discourse community, probably multiple discourse communities, really. Can anyone think of examples? Yeah, sure.
I'll just try to make something up.
That's
a group of people that have a particular, well, I won't use the word discourse, but register, jargon that they use together.
Exactly. Any other ideas? Yeah.
It's a group, maybe to expand on what you said, a group of people who follow certain conventions and who use a certain vocabulary set.
Yeah, and it's expected, right, that you use those conventions in either speaking or writing. So all of you as writing teachers are part of a discourse community. The place you work at is a discourse community, using slightly different conventions. I work in a restaurant. That's a discourse community, right? We have a certain way of speaking that is appropriate to that context. I probably wouldn't speak the same way that I speak there here at this conference today. You might not want to hear that. But these are all discourse communities. University is a serious one. And this is the one that we need to prepare our students to enter. Without these expectations and conventions explicitly known, it's not going to work, okay? So, let's move on here. Sorry for the red writing. This was my attempt. I wanted a background. It was the best choice. The others you couldn't even see. So I'm going to start with two quotes today. It says, while interest in second language writing and approaches to teaching it have increased dramatically over the last decade, teachers are often left to their own resources in the classroom, as much of the relevant theory and research fails to reach them. And following that, a strong teacher is a reflective teacher, and reflection requires the knowledge to relate classroom activities to relevant research and theory. So building on this, the point here is this writing instruction, it's a fairly new area of research, especially the process genre model. And what I want to give you today is we're going to focus on the practical applications of the theory, right? Because theory is great, but in isolation, it's not super helpful unless you can apply it in your practice and you want the theory to inform your practice. So I have like 4 research questions I'll go through, and this will kind of organize the rest of the presentation. So why is writing in a second language so difficult for students to master? Which writing model best meets the needs of this population to prepare them for the discourse community we discussed briefly? What components should be included within the model? And then lastly, what are the benefits? Why should we introduce this prior to the first year of university studies? So right now, I'm going to give you a moment. I want you to just focus on number 1. And you can talk with the person next to you. This probably feels like a writing class, not one of your classes. focus on this question and come up with an answer, okay? And then I'll take some volunteers. There's no right or wrong answer here. I just really want your opinions to get that before we continue any further. So I'll give you like a minute. Let's make it quick. Anything is fine.
First language.
Always the hardest.
So difficult to process all those
Okay, let's come back. I know it's super short amount of time now, but when I was practicing this the other day, I gave too much time, and then it ended up being too long. So what are some ideas with this? I'll go around the room. What are your beliefs about this? Why is it so difficult for students to master?
Can I ask a question about the question?
Yeah, sure.
Is the assumption that of the 4 skills, writing is the hardest? Because I don't think that's necessarily true for everybody.
Sure. I mean, I guess with the amount of time required to really master like this type of discourse, I have, at least in my experience, I have seen students struggle with writing the most. It might not be the same for everyone, but based on this, why is it difficult? And not necessarily more difficult, I guess, than the others. That's a good point. What are some difficulties students may encounter? That might be better for you. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, one thing is lack of experience even in their own language with writing.
Definitely.
Or academic writing.
Anyone else?
But actually the opposite as well. Sometimes they're really good in their own language and now everything's changed.
Conventions change, right?
Totally, and the rules were almost natural to them,
Yeah.
so they don't.
We will talk about that today. Yes.
I just reread an article from like the 1960s the other day, Robert Kaplan, where he talks about cultural thought patterns, and I think that is so important that, you know, I'm having trouble with some Saudi students in their writing, and he talks about that how everything's written parallel, compound sentences, parallel.
Yes.
And wow, that was like really great to go back to that article because I realized they're coming from a whole different way of thinking.
Yeah, and yeah, you can look at like contrastive rhetoric and compares all of those. We'll take one more. Or I'll take one. Yeah.
So on an elementary level, I would say the alphabets are different, but then on an advanced level, getting to the point where you can actually think in English, it's very, very difficult.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so as we hit these today, they'll pop back up again, just so you know we're kind of checking them off as I go along. Okay. Here's my plan. I will start with try to make it a brief overview of the 3 popular writing models, most recent popular writing models in the case for their synthesis. I will then look at a list of components included within the process genre model, details of those components and how you can, suggestions for how to implement them in your teaching, and we'll end with a Q&A session. And just a disclaimer, you know, this is meant to be an overview of this model. I mean, you could spend a lot of time on even one component. And the nice thing about today, and I like how it's planned, if you are interested, and I'll make note as we go, in something like coherence and cohesion or student-driven revision, those are presentations that are coming later, and you'll get more details on those. But I'm providing an overview of the whole thing. So it's a good place to start. Okay. This is an obvious question. How many of you have taught writing courses in an IEP before? probably all of you, right? I mean, this is a writing conference, so that makes sense. But I'm more interested in the second one. What are some adjectives you would use to describe your experience? It can be positive or negative. Was it positive? Was it negative? Was it both? What do you think? Yeah.
I think it's exciting.
Exciting. Okay,
Yeah.
good.
And also frustrating.
Yeah, right? So the parallels. Yep. Anyone else?
Enlightening.
Okay. Anyone else? Challenging, right? It can be difficult. Yeah, I think it kind of hits the whole spectrum there. So here we go. 3 writing models. This is the start here. The product model started in the early 1970s. The process model was a response to that. That started in the mid-1970s. Genre came about in the 1980s. And then what we'll be really focusing on after I go through, establishing the context for this, is the process genre model in the 2000s. And that was established by Badger and White, are the people who coined that term and looked at that. So here we go. I'll try to make the review part quick. It's just for the context. So product model focused on structural linguistics and behaviors theory. So if you remember back to your, if you've ever taken a psychology class, or this comes up a lot, imitation, right? With B.F. Skinner, students learn through imitation. So you're focusing on grammar and vocabulary with an emphasis on accuracy. That was the first model there. This is a very simple form. What it would look like. You focus on the structure, you write your essay, you hand in your essay, end of story, right? There's very little going on in the middle with how you arrive at this accurate essay. So there needed to be a response to that. And then came the process model. This deals with recursive stages of the writing process and a metacognitive awareness. Now, 2 words I think are important here. What is meant by recursive stages in this context? What does recursive mean?
Revision.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely part of it. Anyone else? And I will be showing you some charts, so if you're a visual person, those will help out. Recursive, it basically means that it's not as linear as one's thought, right? When you're actually writing and the process involved, you can step out at any one point and return to an earlier stage, and then you can jump ahead. So it's not this clean start to finish process that the product model made it look like. And metacognitive awareness, at least with what I'm studying now in the K through 12 context, this is coming up everywhere lately. We deal with the Common Core standards from New York, and we're trying to apply those to our lessons. And this is a huge emphasis. It's also an emphasis here. What does metacognitive or metacognition mean in its simple form?
Thinking about thinking.
Yeah, right. We actually, it was nice to see that in the first presentations, because I can connect it to this. Yeah, it's thinking about thinking, right? So we want our students to be aware of what are they doing when they're writing. How can they articulate the process to other people? They should be very, very aware of this. And that raises their metacognitive awareness. Okay, here is another representation of what this can look like. I won't bore you with all of the details there, but what I do want you to look at here is notice how much, with this process model, how much work is done after the initial composition, right? That is quite different than the product model. As you mentioned, revising, and that's part of it. Response to draft, revising, response to revisions, proofreading, editing, evaluation, publishing. You could even have follow-up tasks. This comes from Highland. He's kind of the person that I looked at the most with second language writing, him and Ilona Leakey with academic writing. So a lot of this is informed by those 2 researchers. Okay, let's deal with the genre model. So genre model, again, was trying to add on to the process model. This focused on linguistic patterns and structures of text as resources used by the writer to accomplish certain goals. Okay, so I mean, genres are everywhere. There are many examples of genres. We'll look at genres in terms of expository genres, but think of a job application, a shopping list, a dissertation, a I like weather a lot, so weather.com forecast discussion, right? When you're reading that, there are conventions and expectations on the part of the reader, and the writer uses those to accomplish these goals. So it's communication between the writer and the reader, and we expect those. And without those, it doesn't really accomplish the goals. Okay, so in a summarized form, that's what genre looks at, and I like this model here. I think this is helpful. So. The goal is to develop control of the genre. Now, how can we do that? Well, we start with modeling, so you'll study texts for their structure, their context, their language. You'll analyze them, and then you are constructing texts together, right? So once you look at an expert text, you have this process of joint construction, where you're looking at them together, you're building them together. It helps to build confidence. It serves as an example. And then the end goal here is this independent construction of the text. So we're putting these scaffolds in place, and then as students become more proficient, the goal is to remove them. So they're becoming independent writers at that point. So that's what genre looks like. Now, based on your experience and this brief overview, what would your preference be? Maybe you have a preference in your class, one that you've worked with more than the others. Does anyone have a preference at this point? Any answer is fine. I won't be mad if you say the product. I promise. No, because what we'll talk about in a second, there are strengths and weaknesses of all of them, right? Does anyone have a particular, just strong preference for one over the others? Undecided at this point?
Combination thereof.
Okay, I like that. I think that's a good answer, and I mean, it's obvious that that's the direction that this is going in. But with this, like I said, there are strengths and weaknesses for each of them, correct? So why not, combine or synthesize and remove the weaknesses and play up on the strengths? And that's what the process genre aims to do. So here's the research question: which model best meets the need of university students or bound students? Here we go. Process genre. What's so great about the process genre? Well, it allows students to study the relationship between purpose and form for a particular genre as they use the recursive processes of writing, drafting, revising, and editing. Okay? And that's from Jan, who reviewed this whole method. So, this is an example of what this looks like. I want you to pay attention to the arrows, right? That serves to show the recursive nature. So we're moving down, but we can also move back to earlier stages, all the while receiving input from the teacher, learners, and texts. So it really seeks to marry all of these together. If you look at this side, you've got the genre components there, the situation, purpose, consideration of mode, field, and tenor. And then you have the process components here, and then the end result is a text through that. Now, one thing to look at is these three words here. So mode, field, and tenor. These are characteristics of a genre, and they all make up the register of the text. Someone mentioned the register earlier. So mode, as you know, is just the channel of communication, right? Here it's written. You also have spoken as a mode, but in an essay we're dealing with written communication. Field is your topic of the text. Okay, so it's your situation. What are you writing about? And the tenor is a relationship between the reader and the writer in this case. And we know the tenor is academic, right? The academic tenor is quite different than the tenor you would use to send a text message to your friend. That is another type of tenor, but it's not appropriate in this sense. Now, the one thing to mention. So really with this, it's hard to do 50-50 in terms of the two models together. You're going to have a core element, as stated here. So it's up to you what you choose as your core element. I will let you know that I have chosen the process model as the core element. So there's more to that than there is to the genre aspect. The genre aspect is still present, but I wouldn't say it's an equal percentage throughout this, okay? And when you choose, it's based on what you think your students need. I've chosen the process because I think it's more time consuming to learn that, and ultimately it's more helpful at the end of the day to have that. But genre is here too, and we will see that, and I'll explicitly mention it. Okay.
Eric?
Yeah.
Can I just ask one question?
Yeah.
When you say the genre, in the genre model, are you implying that you study models of it?
You study models of the genre?
Yeah.
Yes, you would start with an expert text, like really nice prototypical examples, and then you look at like the form, like the linguistics forms used. You can look at the structure, and then the big point there is what communicative purpose do those have? So like an introduction, for example, yeah, you can learn how to write an introduction, but if you don't know what it's for, what a thesis accomplishes, then that element's kind of removed. And when you put that in there, it's nice. It adds another dimension. Students are then explicitly aware. So good question. What components should be included? Here we go. And again, you're going to be familiar with a lot of these already. Okay? These probably look very familiar. So focus on form, purpose of genre throughout the process. Okay, so then this would inform all of these, and when you have the opportunity to do this, explicitly look at that, you can, and I'll talk about that. You need to model the process. That will be a theme today. Brainstorming, narrowing and choosing a topic, creating an outline, working thesis, writing the first draft, editing, revision, feedback, and writing the final draft. Now, this is how I've divided it up. You'll see it in different forms. This is going to be the organization for the rest of the presentation. So, I'll be looking at these in detail with you where I can, providing suggestions for implementing them in your teaching, and we'll go from there. So, another great, I like all these diagrams. I tried to recreate these, but they're nice here, so I just used this. PowerPoint is tricky, I haven't used it in a long time. So, this is application of the process genre approach. So you can see, again, we have genre here, providing, identifying, considering the genre, and then the process elements there. And then everything with all the arrows going in both directions, it's all recursive. You can move between them based on the needs of the students, and it works well like that. Okay? On this side we have planning, joint construction, independent construction, revising the text. Okay. Now, expository genres. You are familiar with these, I'm sure. At least when I was teaching with this, these were the ones we looked at. These are the basic formats, right? We can't really do much more until the basic formats are learned. These are your typical 5-paragraph structure essays. And as students go through the levels, it becomes more complex. But we need to start with these before building more complex genres. And these are, they make their way into, research papers and things like that. But we need these first before we can go anywhere else. So I am focusing on these types of genres here. Okay. Now, the basic message here is we need to be explicit. That's the whole thing with this. We can't assume that students come in with this knowledge. We need to explicitly teach all of it. And the way I have this set up aims to do that. So, has anyone heard this question? So we're going to kind of go through the process together. Has anyone heard this question before? I'll read it because you might not be able to see it. Why do the extra work if you aren't going to include all of it in your writing with brainstorming? Anyone had this question posed to them? If you haven't, you're lucky. I used to have this question asked of me all the time because basically with writing, if you want to break it into 3 simple stages, right? There's pre-writing, there's writing, and there's rewriting. The steps that students want to skip, because they take the most time, are the pre-writing section and the rewriting section, and go straight to writing. Yeah?
I noticed in your chart, it says planning, and it said brainstorming, clustering, etc.
Yeah.
But you say brainstorming. Are you using this loosely to mean other
Yeah.
writing?
I will like I have some examples next, and we'll see that. But yeah, I mean, this is the initial stage, right? You really can't do. These are your ideas. It's where your ideas come from. So what does it look like? And here we go with some of this stuff. These are simple things, but they're really helpful, especially when you're getting a group of students who. The assumption is that your students haven't seen this before, and some may come in at a level where they are aware of some of these things. Okay, but you can use a writing journal, WH questions, free writing, idea webs, Venn diagrams, rereading the prompt, taking notes. Some are more suited to genres than others. Like a Venn diagram would be good for what? Compare and contrast, right? So they're meant to be simple, and I think simple is good with this, right? This is not meant to blow your mind in terms of materials. They really are simple, but when you're teaching something like this that's completely new, it should be accessible, right? And I've found that actually providing the materials for the students, they're more likely to use them than if you just say, okay, let's brainstorm. Well, what is brainstorming? So that goes back to being explicit. You have to teach what all of these are and explicitly how to do them. Free writing, and remind me, at the end I have some handouts for you. I made handouts yesterday, and you'll get some of these. Hopefully they're useful. You might use them already. Free writing, write for 10 minutes about your topic without stopping. Write down any ideas you can think of. Don't worry about grammar or whether you will use all of these ideas in your essay. It's meant to just provide flow for them. You want them to just be writing uninterrupted. They're not, self-conscious about what the writing looks like. It's just the initial stage. They need these ideas to build on later so they can then organize them in their outline. And a point that was brought up the other day was at this stage, and it's kind of weird for me now because I used to be in the IEP context and now I'm going down the whole public school road with teaching ESL. I don't know if it's still the same way, but when I was teaching, it was very much an English-only environment, and I know that different schools do it different ways. But this would be one stage, if it's permitted at your school, if it's a belief you have, where the L1 would be useful, at least at lower levels, because you want that continuous flow, and that can be helpful. In public school, sure, we totally encourage that. And like I said, in IEP, when I was working there, it wasn't, but every school is different. So that's just something to consider too. Idea webs, this is my attempt at an idea web. You know what they look like, right? These shapes were hard to... Okay. Next, moving through the process, narrowing and choosing a topic is very important because especially when you're working on longer papers like research papers, you can't do anything. I mean, obviously you have to choose a topic, but you can't do anything until your topic is narrowed enough so that you can place a focus on it, right? The idea here being that your idea is refined at each stage of the process. So you start with this initial idea, and then as you move through the process, it's going through these stages of refinement, and it gets more and more and more focused. So that is absolutely necessary. Here's my star next to that. Okay. Main thing with writing, with outline, is it's a plan for your writing. It turns a big task into manageable tasks. And if I told you that I had trouble with students writing brainstorms before, I really had to twist some arms to get the outline done, at least initially, right? And this is where looking at genre becomes important too, because what's the purpose? Like, what is the purpose of an outline? Why do we need outlines? What do they do? I mean,
organize their ideas.
Yeah, organize your thoughts, right? And if students aren't aware of the purpose of that, then they're very reluctant to do this because it's a lot of work at the beginning. It can be intimidating. Your outline is not your final product, right? Your ideas, again, they are refined after that point. But I had a hard time convincing them that an outline was valuable. So one way to do that is to do something like this. And this is part of your handouts when I give them to a full version of this at the end. We used to work backwards. So what we would do when I said we would study genre we would start a new genre. Let's say it's a persuasive essay or an argumentative essay, whatever you want to call it. We would look at like 2 or 3 different examples, right, of a prototypical, very, very nice, clear text to work with. And we would study those together on the first day or the first couple of days of class. And then I would have students work backwards. So I would create a template like this, and likely I would have some details filled in for them. This is really helpful at intermediate level and moving up. And then they would work together in groups to fill in the rest of the details. Now, what happens when they have this as a finished product? Well, they can now, they're aware of the organization. They have a reference for the rest of the term to use. They can collect these and potentially have versions of all of these for the different genres. And it helps them gain an understanding of how the text is organized. And then they're going to have a better understanding of that when they are actually doing the writing. Yes?
What is the content? I'm a little confused now. Like,
okay, no
when
problem.
you give them a bunch of models, are they on one content area?
No. So let's say they're saying persuasive essays. Like I give them, let's say, one example of a persuasive essay. And the content could be whatever, but the genre needs to be persuasive. All right? And then I have this set up as a template of what it looks like. So they're taking the details from the example essay and they're moving in.
Well, what are they going to write about?
They are just using this to learn the genre. So they will have a topic later, but this is like pre-alt writing. Yeah.
Okay.
So again, like they need to have an explicit understanding of all of these things. So yeah, there's a lot going on before they're even starting. Yeah.
So you're taking an essay that's already done and dissecting it?
Yes,
and putting
exactly.
it in here
Yeah.
so that they can
Yeah, so then they're getting an idea of what the genre looks like. Yeah. I like that dissecting. That's a good way to look at it. Okay. Just briefly on the working thesis. The whole idea of a working thesis, I don't know about you, and if you can, I'm jealous of you. But whenever I'm writing a thesis or anything, it doesn't start out in its finished form, rather. It takes me a long time to get there, right? So, be explicit about this. There were a lot of students who figured, oh, once I have my thesis, that's it. I can't change it. I have to stick to that. No, it develops and it's refined just as the other stages of writing. You're lucky if you can just come up with a thesis and that's the end of the story. Most people aren't like that, so emphasize that. I want to leave enough time here. So in terms of writing the first draft, some things to consider. Go from basic to complex, okay? And you'll see what I mean by that in a second. But start with basic, right? Teach conventions. We take this stuff for granted, right? And this seems extremely obvious to us. But it's not going to be extremely obvious to someone who is coming from a different culture and doesn't have these same conventions, right? Genre and discourse communities are very much a cultural construct too. We have these expectations. I learned this, I don't know what grade I was in, but I've been doing it since, right? And the university has a certain way that they want their papers to look, just on a basic level. So provide a handout like this. It may seem extremely obvious, and it is to us, but we take it for granted, right? Just as if we were to go to a different culture, they may have different format, and we would have to learn that. So the same thing here. I remember having to explain, with a lower level, of course, what does indentation mean? What is the tab key on your computer? So nothing is too obvious. 1-inch margins, things like that. That if you were to hand in something at the university level and it didn't follow these expectations, then there might be some issues, right? So start small, start basic. Next, my mouth is very dry. Rhetorical expectations. You guys have seen this before, right? The infamous shapes here. These are helpful for visual learners. And they are simple, right? A lot of this stuff has been simple, but when you're just teaching someone something new, that's what you want to start with. So, I'll go through these kind of, and you can see how they can go into activities. So you have different ways to begin with your introduction, right? And these are different methods. There are more, but these are the main ones: description, narration, quotation, anecdote. These are a way of avoiding generalizations. At least at lower levels, I would often get generalizations like starting a paper like, there are many people in the world, right? And I'm sure you've seen that before. That's just because these have...
My favorite, Eric, is nowadays.
Yeah, don't want to start on nowadays. But, so anyway, and it's not meant to, put that down or anything. The reason this happens is because students don't have a clear idea of these other options for them. So we can teach them. Again, this is an overview here, so I'm not going into extreme detail on any of those, but these are ways to do it. Provide your background information in your thesis. Here we go, same thing again. This is a handout I've made for you, so you'll get that later if you want it. So you can make this into worksheets. At a low level, it's nice. It's a visual. Students like visuals. And guess what? They are going to remember this more than you simply telling them about it, right? They have this it's a simple graphic organizer for them to work from. Okay? So that when they're just beginning, it's really helpful. Thesis. Thesis is difficult. I remember the first time I wrote a thesis, it wasn't really a thesis, and this was the problem. This was in 9th grade, and I had a term paper, and I wrote something. It was for a history class, and my thesis was about like the date that something happened. And my teacher said, "Eric, that's not a thesis, right? That's a fact." So I had trouble then, and it's still not an easy process now. But your students, if they haven't seen this setup before, this format, I think workshops are helpful. And workshops are something that I'll talk a little bit about when I give you kind of a sample plan of what you could do for 4 weeks. But it's that explicit teaching of the thesis. You can use sentence frames, right? So all these basic genres here, you can set up sentence frames where they're filling in the topics in each paragraph. And you start them basic, and then you slowly remove the scaffolding as they become more proficient. Again, body paragraphs. If you are interested in coherence and cohesion, and you should be, they're not easy to teach. I have great trouble teaching them, and I'm certainly going to go to that conference later today. There is a conference, we're at a conference. There is a talk on teaching coherence and cohesion in your classes. So I would check that out. The deal with these, especially cohesion, it's usually taught as a list of isolated conjunctions or signal words that you use, and it's a lot more than that. It's not quite that simple, and I'm not going to get into it. But topic sentence, supporting details for the body paragraph. Again, you've got the same format. I'm going to go a little quicker now because I do want to save. I have till 11:40. I do want to save some questions at the end. In your conclusion, restate your thesis, summarize your main ideas, interpret your essay, its significance in future applications. You guys get the picture by now, right? I'm big on these graphic organizers. Okay. If you have a moment, I know it's a lot of text, but take a look through this. Just read through it, and then, you'll get it right away. I'll explain after. Okay. So this is from Paul Merrill, who was a scientist and a writer, and he was poking fun at the fact that scientific writing is notoriously dense and inaccessible to people outside the discourse community, right? So we don't want students writing to be like that. And the other main point is, how ridiculous is it to not edit, right? Your writing only improves when you're editing. So editing needs to be a huge part of this whole process, and that's what I'll get into next. So I've divided this into just 3 sections here. You might see it in different formats. But for this presentation, peer editing, a big topic, student revisions, and teacher feedback. the red pen, right? Do you use a red pen when you edit?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I do. There are other choices, but this is the only type of editing, right? Your red pen doesn't have to be your only option here. Get the students involved. So we'll start with peer editing. Peer editing is great because students get a sense of their audience, okay? It increases their motivation. They become more confident. And the last one is especially awesome. It helps them to evaluate their own writing better. At the end of everything, when they leave the program, they need to be able to know how to evaluate their own writing. Unfortunately, you can't go to your professor at university and ask them to edit everything for you. They wouldn't like that very much. And they wouldn't have time to do it. So we need to have students who are self-sufficient in this regard, and we have to teach them that. So, if you, once students are clear on what peer editing looks like and what they need to do, they'll be happy like this. If they're not, they may not look so enthused. Okay, I really liked this. This came from lEPs, who is also someone who studies academic writing. Sample peer review questions. So this is a helpful way of teaching them what to actually look for. What was the best, most interesting part of this composition? Why do you think so? Was there any part of the writing where you needed more information just to understand? What did you need to know? Why do you think, who do you think was the intended audience? How do you know? Did the draft seem to follow the pattern? Note everything you liked or feel was not successful? Do you have any other comments or suggestions? So guess what? When students are editing, and you know this, grammar is not the only thing to look for. But why do you think, if you tell your students to peer edit and don't explain what it is, why do you think they go straight to grammar?
It's the easiest.
Yeah, it's the most obvious too, right? What are some possible issues with that, though?
They don't know what they're talking about.
Put one way, yeah. Or they may be correcting things that maybe don't need correction, and then the student would listen and make the correction. It can be an issue, yeah.
I've also found that it sets up then this dynamic of your word against my word.
Yes.
And then sort of the whole other purpose of peer editing kind of falls away.
Oh yes, that has happened. When I started it, that used to be the way it would go, right? And it led to arguments sometimes, or people, like you said, refusing to listen to someone else. You don't want to set up that atmosphere. So these are great. Remember earlier we talked about metacognitive awareness, and an awareness of the genre. We're looking at the pattern. We're looking at the intended audience. That's a big one with genre, right? So when students start to examine these things, they really get a better understanding of what they're doing when they write. And it's meant to be positive, right? Note everything you liked, feel was not successful. Okay, then constructive criticism. Do you have any other comments or suggestions? So it's really a nice process when you base it around this. Yeah?
Are these questions meant to steer them away from even focusing on grammar?
Well, not initially, yes. There's kind of like a hierarchy of things you should look at in a specific order, and that's actually the next slide, I think. Yeah, it is. So here are some things students can revise. And building on your question there, what would you have them look for first when they're editing? Or revising, sorry.
Is this peer editing or when they're revising
This
themselves?
this is after the fact of peer editing. This could come into peer editing too. You could combine these, and a lot of these are flexible in that way. So let's say this is student revisions. They've had the peer editing session, and now they're going to go back and make the changes, the revisions on their own. What should they look for first? Remember what I said earlier about basic to complex. That makes it less overwhelming, and they want to go through in stages here. Right, because if you're looking for everything at once, it's tough. I can't do that.
Excuse me, Eric, just one clarification. Are they looking at the first draft?
It could be, now, again, with the whole recursive thing, and we'll talk about this in the plan at the end, but if they could have many different drafts. So this could be after any draft. It could be the first draft, it could be, yeah. Yeah.
One thing that I've done when I've totally gotten frustrated,
Sure.
in the first draft, actually, I'll have them underline, I say the 5 key sentences.
Okay.
So it'll be thesis statement, the 3 topic sentences, and the restatement. And then I pull them out, and in a later session, I just post all of them in groups, and I'll group A and B, and I'll say, well, which one do you like better?
Yeah.
And they invariably pick the one that is best organized.
Yeah.
And so we use that for a follow-up session. But that's an attempt at student awareness of their own writing, like underline.
Yeah,
you know.
no, I like that. And then you're kind of combining some of the questions from peer editing with this, and you can totally do that.
When I did peer editing, and I'd say to somebody, if you say, does this have a thesis statement? They always said yes, because they wanted to help their friends. Yes, it has 3. Yes, it has topic sentences.
Yeah.
Yes, it has a thesis statement.
Yeah.
So I say, okay, well, underline it. Where is it? You know, and then they'd have more trouble.
Yeah.
And then if you pull them out, then it becomes even more.
So maybe start with this, okay? And that's what I would say. And then the ones in the middle are, you know, that's a bit more debatable, and then I would end with grammar. Grammar should be the last thing that you look at. It's not to say that grammar is not important. Of course it is, and the accuracy is important. But if there's this preoccupation with grammar throughout the whole process, it kind of overshadows all these other great things that can be happening.
There's some people who categorize revisions, and the one that does it in 3. So the first one's called global,
Yeah.
and that only deals with the content in
Yeah.
essence, which could get a little to your first one if the things that are not in unity. And then the second one is local, and then you're looking at paragraphs and transitions, and then the third one is surface, and that's when you do.
I like that. That's said better than it is here. But yeah, it's there is a hierarchy that you want to look at when you're doing that. In addition to this, you can organize student-teacher conferences if you have time. This is great if you have the time, and we know that can be an issue sometimes. But student-teacher conferences, 2 things would recommend here. Highland recommends this revise and resubmit letter. This is awesome. So with their final draft, students would turn in a reflection paper telling you or writing to you what they revised in their paper, why they did it, how their paper has improved. And I mean, then you're really raising the bar on the whole metacognitive awareness aspect. So that's something you could include. It's going to be more difficult for lower level. It might be something that's better geared toward advanced students. And then the self-analysis question would kind of be building on the peer editing questions, but they would have more to do with the process itself. Okay? So asking them about their thinking at each stage of the process, what was most difficult, what do they need to improve on the most, things like that. Okay, we're almost to the end here. With teacher feedback, final part of this, I think less is more. And when I say less is more, you can use correction codes, and those look like this. Now you might see this. This is from where I used to work. We came out with this kind of template to use with the correction codes. Now the codes are here, and you might say, well, that's a lot. Like that's a lot of stuff that the students then have to learn and things like that. And they have all the explanations. And yes, they would have to learn this, so there's a bit of a learning curve with it. The goal being, though, with this, eventually, I think you want to transition to simply circling or underlining. That would be the ideal, right? Because then they're really independent on their own. It takes a long time. Not all of this stuff is going to go in one session and be perfect. It may take multiple sessions just to get it down.
I think the most independent is you just mark it in the margin that there is an error.
And that's really independent. But again, it will take, if no one has done a lot of editing, it takes a while to get to that point. Okay, the last 2 questions to answer, and didn't necessarily go in that order, but why is writing so difficult for students to master? What are the benefits for introducing this? Here are some facts about L2 writers that you're probably already aware of. They have differences in linguistic proficiency, learning experience, their classroom expectations, their ways of organizing text, their processes, and then with the genre, the understanding of text uses and value of different text types. How does that translate? Well, it translates this way in their essays. Again, they organize differently, different approaches to argument. This is big, and this could be its own topic. Different ways of incorporating material. Didn't quite get into this because that's a huge area, and a difficult one at that. Use of quotes, paraphrase, and unacknowledged borrowing. Again, that's a cultural thing too. We have expectations in our discourse community that differ from other cultures. And that's why it's kind of a sticky issue to, accuse someone of plagiarism. Well, that might not be the intention. You know what I mean? And then if we go down, different estimates of reader knowledge, cohesion. Talk about that later at the talk. Less subordination, passives, all that linguistic stuff there. Complexity of style. You get the picture. All right. What are the challenges? Here's the big deal. Teachers often mistakenly assume learners have prior knowledge of text genres or share their cultural beliefs about language. And surface errors may actually be less serious than just perception of what good writing is. Good writing, again, is this cultural expectation. Good writing here is different than good writing in Japan, for example, right? Now, but I think when students are studying here, they need to understand what we expect as good writing because this is where they're studying. It would be the same if I were to go to France, for example, or Russia. Cultural beliefs, yeah. I just wanted to underline the fact that it is a cultural belief. Why is it so difficult? You're not just learning to write, you're acquiring the literacy skills of a new culture. That's the big point here. You're not simply learning to write. It's a new culture, and you need to acquire these literacy skills. We've been acquiring them since, we have been acquiring them at a young age. And they're coming in behind the curve, so they need to catch up. Good writers imagine how people or readers respond to texts. They're familiar with conventions and expectations. Okay, how does this work in terms of a syllabus? I promise there's a syllabus. There's some suggestions here at the end. Consider all of these things: students and their needs, target context, selection of materials, evaluation of learners. With evaluation in terms of process versus product, the evaluation is much more formative versus summative. Formative meaning you're looking at the whole process versus this final product, and that's the final grade. You can grade them on their progression throughout the process and their increasing familiarity with this. Okay, when I used to teach, we had 4-week sessions. It's very, very short. I'm not sure how it's organized here in other programs. Hopefully you have more time. The more time you have with this, the better, right? The more you can focus in on that. So we would have to finish 2 essays in 4 weeks. And this is kind of how I would set it up. This is flexible. But as I said, the first day you could do an intro to the genre, read your example essay, try out an outline activity, the one I said with focusing on the forms. Start your topics and brainstorming. And you can just look through. There are a lot of workshops here, so you give this explicit instruction with sentence frames on how do you write a conclusion, what does it look like. Yeah. And that's where some of those handouts that I have and that you saw on the slides would come in handy. Notice student-teacher conferences have a lot of time there, and editing and revisions, right? So, these are things that need to be, you really need to spend the time on. So there's that. Okay, summary. The synthesis of these models can help to prepare students for the community. Select one core writing model and integrate other relevant models based on the student needs. As you saw with mine, and as I told you, it was more process, but genre is there as well. You could easily design it more around genre, but it would look a little bit different. And it's time consuming to design it this way, but it is worth it. It might take a few tries, though, to get it to where you want it to be. Now, we're excited. Just 2 points to address here. It depends, much of this depends on your level of autonomy and freedom within your program. You might have a very set curriculum, and if that's the case, then you know that, and you need to be obviously aware of that. But the more freedom you have with this, the more you can kind of incorporate in what you want and what you think is important based on what you saw here. The other big one is being consistent. This was an issue when I started to introduce this where I was before. So I would have students in my class and they would learn it, and then they would go to another level and they would not do the same thing, and then they'd come back to a level later with me and I'd say, okay, let's do our outline. What's an outline, right? So it had been unlearned, essentially. So unless everyone's on the same page, and you would have to have a conversation about that, it can be be tough because it's confusing to go from one expectation to another and back to another. So at the end here, any additional questions, comments, or concerns? That's my email address, but I have a couple minutes now if you have questions. Yeah?
Can you talk a little bit more about workshops? How do you do it?
Sure. So with the workshops, let's say we're doing a workshop on writing, writing the introduction, right? You could start, and this goes back to the process model, this joint construction of text together. So you'd have to take, maybe a class, maybe it ends up being a whole class, and you look at examples of introductions together, and then you choose a couple topics, or you have students come up with topics for a certain genre with you, and you say, okay guys, let's write this introduction together. And this is helpful, at a lower level when they haven't seen this. You would have them giving you ideas. They could go into groups, and then you're writing it on the board for them as they're dictating to you what they've come up with. And then they're seeing that, this is possible. It's not an impossible task. And I have the example now. I have my handouts with the organization. And you're spending a lot of time showing them explicitly how it's constructed. All right? And then genre can come in there too. You look at, okay, why do I do this? What is the purpose of this? And then it becomes a little more just useful to them when they know that they're doing it for a specific purpose. It's not just writing. It's not just to work on something. So you could do with conclusion, the body paragraphs, something as simple as writing topic sentences. Yeah.
So do you usually do it before you see any problem or after as a kind of summary?
Yeah, sure. It would me, myself, I used to do it just initially, right out of the gate. You could do it like if you weren't seeing problems, right, then maybe it's not necessary to do all of that. And if it weren't, then no, you wouldn't need to spend all that time. So that's a good question. Maybe you have time for one more question?
One more question.
Okay. Any more? No? Okay, well if you want to contact me, that's my school email. I check it all the time. I can't not check it because it's always on my phone, so you emailed me. And guys, thank you for attending. My first conference, so I'm glad I did it. If you want